Hi, my name is Claire Woodward, and I am presenting a study that I have worked on with Ben Hisks and Fritz Breithaupt about how victimization triggers spontaneous side-taking in narratives. And we have been working on the study in Fritz Breithaupt's experimental humanities lab at Indiana University. The main question that we were hoping to answer in our study was how strong spontaneous side-taking in narratives was and what its effects were. In thinking about this project, we considered different models to guide our hypotheses and how spontaneous side-taking would take place and what these effects would be. So the first model that we considered is the dyad model. And this is inspired by Wegner and Gray. And summed up, the dyad model portrays conflict as taking place between two sides, the victim and the perpetrator, or the agent and patient. And it inspires an audience to look for the victim and the perpetrator, to identify them and determine fault and who is in need of protection. And Wegner and Gray show a strong preference for the perceived victim in a conflict. And this is also in line with theories of competitive victimhood, when we look for who has suffered the most in a conflict in order to decide who to side with. And often in such a scenario, we will pick the side we perceive as the greater victim. And we can see this model playing out in lots of popular media today as well. The second model that we considered is the bystander coordination model. And this is inspired by Dascoli and Kurzban. And in this model, morality leads observers and bystanders to the same side. So it's coordinated without planning that coordination as a general effect. This then minimizes the effects of people's personal commitments to avoid fissures and their collective side-taking. And this model relies on a cognitive flexibility in that side-taking, the act of side-taking depends on the unfolding action, so the here and now, and not on the past in making a decision of who is in the right and who is in the wrong. So it would show that people are willing to change their mind as a conflict unfolds. The third model that we considered is the three-person model of empathy, inspired by Breithaupt. And in this model, it is irrelevant why people take a side to begin with. What matters is that this initial choice will stick, and it will be difficult to change sides despite new information that may incriminate their original choice. In this model, perspective taking and empathy lead to continuous confirmation and enforcement of the spontaneous act of side-taking, and thus increased polarization instead of a willingness to move back and reconsider another perspective. So instead, this leads to a reaffirmation of the initial choice. And thus is relatively cognitively inflexible. So the four more focused project questions that we asked were, do people consistently and spontaneously side with characters who have been victimized? Two, what are the effects of victimization for both the victim character and the aggressor character? We examine relatability, understanding, perception of moral goodness, and attribution of authorship. Three, will people pay more attention to victims or perpetrators? In particular, how does an event of aggression impact memory about later events concerning the victim character and the aggressor character? This question we thought would have particular implications in the way that people remember other accounts of conflict and whose side that they would focus on and then relay to others as well. And then our final question was, will people continue to be loyal to one side when receiving information about an ongoing narrative in which both characters are equally aggressive? And here we measure loyalty positively by conviction about a selected side and negatively by switching sides. So we conducted 2 studies to answer these questions. In both studies, participants read stories with 2 characters and were interrupted after each paragraph to respond to questions about the characters regarding their side-taking preferences and associated confidence in their choices. And for both of these studies, we found participants through Amazon's Mechanical Turk. So for study 1, we introduced a 3-part narrative. The story presents 2 characters that are first engaged in friendly interaction until one morally harms the other in part 2, and then things return to normal for part 3, but the characters do not further interact. And we had 127 participants with an average age of 40. Here are the questions that we asked after each of the 3 parts. Who do you think is telling the story on a scale from 1 to 7? How confident are you that this character is telling the story? I in particular was very interested about authorship in who owns stories and what that means to be the narrator of a story and how that story might change if one knows that you are either the victim or the perpetrator of in a conflict. In a conflict, with whom would you side after part 1, before the conflict takes place, and then after the aggression, whose side are you on? Whom do you understand better? On a scale from 1 to 7, how well do you understand both the aggressor and the victim? Who is more relatable? On a scale from 1 to 7, how morally good is the aggressor and the victim? And then after the 3rd part, we asked additional memory questions about each character, so at the end of the narrative. And we alternated which character committed the aggressive act, so as not to have one character that generally would be more relatable or understandable overall. So one of our most interesting findings was that participants showed a better memory of victim characters. They were fairly easily able to remember facts about the victim. These would be things like what color was the victim's hair, or what were they doing at work, where were they traveling to for the upcoming holiday. Whereas memory for the aggressor was not nearly as good, and participants were incorrect just as often as they were correct about their memory. So this shows a strong focus on the victim after the aggression, and willingness to follow them, in a greater willingness perhaps to follow them than follow the aggressor. In our other items, we found that participants sided more often with victim characters and found them more relatable and more likely to be the author of the story. We also found that participants perceive victims as more moral and understandable immediately following the aggression. This, especially with morality, makes sense that after someone commits an aggression, that their morality would fall. So these results favor the dyad and 3-person model, in keeping with both theories in parts 2 and 3. After the aggressive action, participants tended to side more with the victim. So while in this study, we primarily investigated the connections between victimhood, relatability, authorship, memory, and spontaneous side-taking. We did not look at how spontaneous side-taking sticks. In particular, we were also curious if sympathetic priming information continues to affect confidence in side-taking over the course of a narrative. So in study 2, we had 322 participants with 137 as female and an average age of 38. And in this design, we provided a sympathetic priming background for either character A or character B. And then we had both characters act aggressively toward each other in 5 paragraphs with escalated violence in each of them. And in doing this, we hope to not have a clear perpetrator victim dyad, but rather show 2 equally unlikable parties and look at how participants would respond to such a narrative. So and after each paragraph, they would rate preference for A or B and the strength of their support. We also alternated priming and which character began the aggressive act or did the very first initial act. So in here are these specific questions after each paragraph: which character is more justified than the other, and how much you feel you support this character, rating your conviction on a scale from 0 to 10, with 10 being the most. So what we found here is that more participants sided with the prime character throughout the narrative. This was not super surprising to us. And we see the strongest difference in the very first paragraph. So the priming came right here. They make their decision here. And the number of participants who side with the prime character does go down, but remains consistently more than those who sided with the unprimed character. Participants also showed a greater confidence in their choice for the prime character. Again, we see a starker contrast right at the beginning, but it does remain above even by the end. Things have descended into chaos, and characters are slashing each other's tires and breaking each other's arms. It's total chaos, but still we have, and again, if the scale begins at 0, relatively high amount of confidence overall in that it's greater than 0 for the character that they choose to side with. We also divided our participants into 4 groups: those who always sided with the prime character, those who most recently sided with the prime character but had switched sides at some point in the narrative, those who most recently sided with the unprimed character here but had switched sides, and those who sometimes sided with always sided with the unprimed character. And we did this in order to target the effect of side switching. These results indicate that both sympathetic priming information and previous side taking influence the convictions with which people favor a character in a conflict. So in our discussion, we find that when people spontaneously take a side for a victim, that, well, first of all, they tend to side with the perceived victim in a conflict. Second, that people attribute authorship to the victim and rate the victim as more understandable, relatable, and of higher perceived morality. 3, people have better memory of the perceived victim than of the perpetrator. And our second study showed us that people are more likely to continue to side with the same character over time when they receive sympathetic priming information and are more confident in their choice than those who switch sides or sided with a non-prime character. So We show that victimization triggers spontaneous side taking and leads to a better memory of the victim. When spontaneous side taking is maintained and prolonged over time, people have higher confidence in their choices than when they previously switched sides. Our results also favor the three-person model of empathy and the dyad model, as they demonstrate how perceived disadvantages and victimization triggers side taking in narratives and can potentially lead to ongoing polarization. So some of the lingering effects of spontaneous side taking is that spontaneous side taking is maintained and prolonged over time. And when this happens, people have higher confidence in their choice than when they previously switched sides. Our study has implications for an increasingly polarized society where many people believe that they have the right side. Framing stories around victimhood leads to spontaneous side taking and may make spontaneous side taking more salient. While one may hope that spontaneous side taking trains flexibility of the mind not only to choose a side quickly in a conflict, but also escape entrenched polarization by imagining another's perspective, our study suggests that spontaneous side taking may stick and thus result in cemented side taking and polarization. It seems that spontaneous side taking is connected to people's willingness to give voice to the other's unwillingness to give voice to the other side of an issue or conflict, showing an inflexibility of mind here. And this is, can be seen in current conversations about cancel culture and safetyism, strengthened by echo chamber effects in media consumption. Side taking then becomes another side effect of existing within an echo chamber. Thank you.